Welcome back. This is episode 10 of From Guns to Keyboards. Going to do a bit of a news recap before we focus in on today's podcast, which is going to discuss the protests in the United States and how that plays into American Jewish identity. First, brief news recap. We have the Israeli raid into eastern Rafah going on at the same time as these negotiations are happening between Israel and Hamas, where we are seeing this raid happening alongside a potential breakdown in negotiations for the release of hostages. Hamas released some sort of counter-proposal to the Israelis that the Israelis claim that they've never seen and aren't aware of the conditions of this agreement, and it seems as if the two sides are at an impasse. In the United States, as I mentioned, the topic of our main episode, campuses across the country have been overtaken by anti-Israel protests. Arguably, many of these protests are highly anti-Semitic. We'll definitely go into this during our podcast. And finally, our last news point for our recap today is the internal dissent and protests within Israel regarding the situation in Israel and Gaza. Many Israelis who are calling on the government to do whatever it can to release the hostages or come to an agreement that will release the hostages, even if it means ending the war. Other Israelis on the other side of the political spectrum disagreeing completely and wanting Israel to fight this war until its end. And we're going to wait and see how all these different factors play out.
Yeah, I can already tell it's going to be a good one because just hearing the way you described the campus protest, I have a lot, and I think that I wouldn't have framed it in the way that you framed it, essentially. So, all right, so let's talk campus protests. To be clear, I was actually in LA during Passover. What was amazing about being in LA is that you don't actually feel any of this. You don't there. Israel, Palestine. We forget, I think, because we live in Israel, and so we're consumed by it every day, and we're consumed with what the U.S. thinks. And the campus protests have done an incredible job just capturing the 24-hour news cycle and making themselves very prominent on social media. But the reality is, for your everyday American, when it comes to even just Israel-Palestine, the issue is very low on their priorities. And actually, there's recent polling that came out showing that as well, that out of the major issues coming into the election, the Israel-Palestine is like 15 out of 16. Most Americans are concerned about the economy, they're concerned about the job market, and they're concerned about gas prices. And gas prices are the only thing that ties Israel-Palestine to them. That being said, there's obviously a large group who does care very passionately about Israel-Palestine. I know you mentioned that they were anti-Semitic. I don't think that they're anti-Semitic intention. I think they're anti-Zionist, which some people do tie in as being inherently anti-Semitic. I don't think that that's actually the case. I think these are actually these are young people, college-age people, tend to be at more of elite colleges, as we've seen in these protests, I don't doubt that these people have a real, they see a wrong, what they perceive as a wrong happening in the world, and they want to commit themselves to doing it. That being said, I think if you were to ask these people, hey, what do you actually know about the conflict? Very little would be my guess as to what a 19 or 20-year-old college student at UCLA or Columbia University actually knows about what's going on. And I think what ends up happening is that a lot of times they start saying things, particularly for, when they start saying things like from the river to the sea, for instance, a lot of Israelis interpret that as the erasure of Israel, which obviously makes us very uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, I think that it's important to clarify with all these protests going on in the States that obviously it is legitimate to criticize any government and government policies. And even though I, of course, don't agree with these anti-Israel protesters and the policy that they support, I would never say that they don't have the right to free speech or the right to express themselves or to say whatever they want to say about Israel and government policy. I think that's all fair game, and I wouldn't call them anti-Semitic off the bat just for the sake of pulling that card and shutting down debate. That being said, there were numerous expressions in many of these protests, I'm not saying all of them, but a significant number of these protests that, in my opinion, were undeniably anti-Semitic. For instance, seeing protests where protesters were openly calling for Al-Qassam to go after the Jewish students on campus and to kill them. There were very open calls for that.
Yeah, blocking Jewish students from accessing parts of the campus.
Blocking Jewish students from accessing parts of campus. Other phrases I agree with you, like saying that you're anti-Zionist or from the river to the sea, can be more debated as what are the fine lines between policy disagreement and anti-Semitism. I think that you're right about that there is some gray area there. But I think that these protests were very unique when it comes to anti-Israel protests in the States, because for the first time we saw very, very clear expressions of anti-Semitism. When a student leader at Columbia, as we saw in this infamous video, says that it's okay to kill Zionists in a very blanket way, I read this as the same coded anti-Semitism that many white supremacists in the States use when they refer to African Americans that they believe should be killed or removed from certain social groups, just like Nazi ideology promoted or has promoted over the many years.
It's very important, though, to point out, to at least acknowledge that within these protests, a lot of the protesters are very quick to point that, a lot of their leadership and a lot of the people involved are from organizations like, Jewish Voices for Peace and If Not Now. And these are both organizations that you go to their websites and the first thing they describe themselves is just vehemently anti-Zionist. Now, does that mean you should go around killing anti-Zionists like that one protest leader suggested? No, of course not. But at the same time, look, there's a 20-year-old kid, or however old he was, and he was arrested for it, which I think is fair and acceptable. And this is where I kind of come to a problem with some of these protests, is that I understand the university. I think the universities, to be honest, are quite afraid after what happened with Harvard, UPenn, and I think MIT, where I think Harvard and UPenn the president there were forced to step down as a result of those congressional hearings. Remember, they were asked, is calling for the genocide of Jews okay? And the whole famous context matters line. So a lot of these deans, I think, are very scared that their heads are on the chopping block as well, and so they're bringing in the police to really shut it down because they see that elite opinion in Washington is very pro-Israel, is very anti these protests. The police themselves, I actually feel, have behaved in a very responsible and professional way. There doesn't seem to have been any major instances of police brutality. I think it's most of the universities themselves who are trying to quash these protests as quickly as they can.
But I think a lot of these responses that we're seeing from university presidents, sure, maybe we could say that some of it is due to presidents trying to, quote unquote, save their own asses and protect themselves from the sort of mass national scandals that we saw surrounding the UPenn scandal and other university presidents. But when we see the way these protests have played out, it seems that the use of police was quite fair. We were seeing that in many protests, that the protesters themselves were acting in a borderline violent, if not violent fashion towards other students on campus, towards the infrastructure on university, taking over buildings by force. I think that the use of police in this case, putting aside even the issues of Israel and the Palestinians, and putting aside the whole ideological side of this debate, just when I look at the conduct of these students, I think the use of armed force was very fair.
Sure, but these are isolated incidents as well. The destruction of property that you mentioned, the intimidation that we saw, and the calls for violent attacks, these are all very isolated incidents as well. This is happening across dozens of universities, and we see in the vast majority of them, the police are just immediately being called. They're saying, hey, you can't camp out here, you can't stay in this area, you're being disruptive, leave. On the one hand, there is an argument to be made. Sure, you can say that, look, disruption in university is not acceptable, and these protests need to be removed as a result. At the same time, though, universities since the 1960s have always considered themselves to be places of civil protest and civil unrest. The centers of these sort of calls for civil rights. And so, on the one hand, you have these universities sort of marketing themselves in that way. And then once it actually happens and there's a protest that these university presidents don't like and that they cause them to fear for their jobs, then suddenly they call down the boot of the law to bring people out.
Fair enough, but one should know that if you're bringing up the civil rights protests in the 1960s, whereas those protests were protests for peace and protests for the expansion of civil rights in the United States, the protests that we're seeing in Israel, and I don't think that this is beyond an isolated incident, are calling for an expansion of aggression and violence against the state of Israel. Yeah, they are calling for, from what their perspective is, an end to the war.
I don't see it though.
But it's not a. But it's not a end to the war and peace for all. From their perspective, this is a expansion of the war and from the river to the sea, the destruction of the state of Israel. Even if we look at that phrase of from the river to the sea, which is not an isolated incident, this is the phrase that everyone is using. Even if we look at this as a purely policy perspective of we're going to replace the state of Israel with a Palestinian state, and in this ideal world, all of the Jews living in what was formerly the state of Israel will be equal citizens in a future Palestinian state that will expand everywhere from Gaza to Tel Aviv to Hebron. Even if we do take that scenario as being the scenario here, we're still looking at a movement that's fundamentally focused at its core on aggression. Very different from what we saw in the 1960s.
Yes and no. I mean, look, the 1960s became incredibly violent by the time you get to the end of that decade. And I mean, look what happened after 1968. You had Richard Nixon and the tough on crime policy. We can get back to that one later. But to speak to your point of what are these protests fundamentally about, the destruction of Israel and through violent or otherwise means. Look, I think at the end of the day, there are certainly, I'm not going to deny that there are people within those protests, and I'm not even going to deny there are protest leaders who that's exactly what they feel. And they when they say from the river to the sea, they mean wipe Israel off the map and have a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. I think it's exactly what they mean. A lot of other protests, though, I think are calling for a ceasefire. It's that they see it as, look, this war is getting too violent. There's too many there's too many dead civilians that are dying every day. Let's stop this war just for the sake of humanity, kind of thing. And I think having police present at these protests, completely acceptable. I would, if I were university president, I would say, okay, let's have them there. But also, let's not forget, a lot of these protests, what they're really calling for is just for they want their universities to divest from anything, from any corporations that do business with Israel. So, there's a lot of university endowment funds. They work with a lot of these, Wall Street financial institutions, many of whom buy Israeli bonds or work also investing in Israeli private companies or public works. And they want that to stop. And what ended up happening, I believe it was at Brown or at Yale, I don't remember exactly, but the administration told the protesters, okay, come October, we're going to vote on divestment. We're going to have the student body vote whether or not to divest. And that actually stopped the protests. They said, great, we can actually have this sort of democratic vote to decide whether or not we want to do this. And it dispersed the protesters. That I think kind of showed, at least in that isolated incident right there, that acknowledgement of what the protesters wanted stopped the protest before it got out of hand. I think that's something worth noting.
It is worth noting, but I think that the fundamental litmus test here that we have to use to understand whether or not these protests are at their core a legitimate expression of political opinion or a illegitimate expression of hate. The core litmus test that we have before us is whether or not we would feel comfortable going to these universities as students. We are two American Jews, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about our own perspectives as American Jews who moved to Israel and how we see things. I ask myself a very basic question. Would I feel comfortable myself as a student or encouraging my fiance, Yael, in this imaginary world where we're back in the States and we're both learning at university? Would I feel comfortable going to campus right now? And I think that as a former American university student, I can say with very high confidence that I've been on campus when there were many pro-Palestinian protests. Not once did I ever shy away, not once did I ever feel uncomfortable. But if you ask me now, seeing what we have been seeing across the United States, would I feel comfortable myself going or sending a significant person in my life to go to campus during this time? I would recommend staying at home. And I think that's a very sad litmus test that we have to ask ourselves what that really means about the impact of these protests on campus.
Well, look, feelings are feelings. I'm not going to, tell you your feelings are wrong in that sense. But at the same time, we have to look at data as well. I mean, how many Jewish students have we seen that have been physically assaulted? The worst we've seen, I think, is just that Jewish students in some cases have been cordoned off from going to class. You have this sort of like, it's passive aggressive. I don't even want to say it's peaceful. It's passive aggressive, where you have Jewish students trying to walk through their campus quads, and you have people standing around them. Some Jewish students have claimed to be attacked. I think that their claims have been a little fabricated. I know there was someone who went on Piers Morgan, who during an interview who claimed that she got hit in the eye like the day before. I mean, either she had incredible makeup or just as like Wolverine, because she looked completely fine to me. And at the same time too, look, this is why also I encourage police presence on it. There have certainly been incidents of violence, and the police have arrested the people responsible, which I think is completely justified, completely admirable. And the problem too is any movement that you do, doesn't matter whatever political position you take, you're going to attract the worst people who tangentially agree with that position. So let's say if you want to make an anti-immigration policy, then you're going to attract racists. If you want to have a pro-Israel, like we saw actually recently at UCLA, you had these pro-Israel protesters, I don't want to say counter-protesters who showed up, some of whom began shooting fireworks at the Palestinian protesters and assaulting them. And if that's you and you're listening to this podcast, stop doing that, please. You are not helping anybody. But again, you attract the worst. And the same with you have a pro-Palestinian protest, you're going to attract Hamas supporters, and you're going to attract people who believe in Islamic terror as a way of removing Israel from the map. That's just unavoidable.
I agree that every protest and any political movement will attract extremes, but we're not looking here at the sheep. We're looking at the wolves. We're looking at many universities, the leaders of these protests. And again, I agree with you that it depends on university. Not all universities are the same. Some campuses we saw more signs of extremism than other campuses. I don't want to group them all together and say they're a bunch of anti-Semites. I think that's unfair. But I do think that it would also be an exaggeration on the other side of things to say that these were just a bunch of hooligans that joined along the protests and weren't part of the core of the pro-Palestinian support. I think they were both. I think you probably had individuals that, exactly like you said, I think you're right, who joined along during the way. And you also had core leadership of these university students, like we saw at Columbia, where one of the student leaders of the pro-Palestinian movement did come out and make a comment that was widely condemned as anti-Semitic, and the student was later expelled, who made comments that were very clearly calling for the death of Jews.
Right, profile.
I want to take this conversation back to what you said earlier. You mentioned a really interesting statistic where you spoke about what do Americans actually care about. And you said that most Americans look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as being something far down the list of priorities that the American government needs to focus on. And I agree with you, how do you explain the gap between the intense media coverage and the passion that a lot of these students have on campus for these protests and what Americans seem to care about according to opinion polls?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's Israel-Palestine, which has always attracted eyeballs, and it's war. You know, it's that old cliche media saying, if it bleeds, it reads. And, I mean, Israel just dominated the 24-hour news cycle, just like Ukraine dominated the 24-hour news cycle in the months after the Russian invasion. I mean, now it's been over 2 years, and how often do you see Russia, Ukraine? Almost never. Like, it's now no longer the cycle, and I think the same is going to happen with Israel-Palestine. And by the way, these types of protests that we're seeing were extremely common in the late 1960s, early 1970s, during the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, which marked a real change in the civil rights movement, where African Americans, particularly in the North, particularly in universities, stopped being pro-Israel. And to take it back a little bit further, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Baptists who initially led the civil rights movement were extremely pro-Israel. They saw Israel as this is a shining example of how an oppressed minority group can emancipate themselves and achieve sovereignty and self-determination. And for a lot of these Southern Baptists who were, obviously deeply religious, and the Bible gave them a lot of close ties to this sort of land of Zion, they saw this, they related to this, and this was the kind of the ideal. And not only that, but there was also large, within the initial civil rights movement in the late 1950s and early 60s, Jews were some of the first whites to participate in the civil rights movement. I know you and I have kind of briefly talked about the whole are Jews white question. Maybe we can circle back to that at some other time. But Jews were some of the first leaders of the NAACP. They were some of the first leaders of the initial civil rights movement. There was a very strong Jewish-Black alliance. The first white people who joined the Alabama boycotts, they were Jews. They were some of the first ones to join these movements. And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence showing that because they were white, they were targeted especially aggressively by a lot of the southern locals. Again, this is not to take away the African American leadership that really led these movements, really gave it the power and the numbers to really become this large, sweeping, historical movement that it really was. And we saw it as a result of this, as a result of Jewish money, Jewish political influence, by the way, in Washington as well, and Jews and African Americans working hand in hand. You had the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act that passed. What ended up happening, though, and there's a long history as to why exactly this happened, but you had a lot of African Americans living in the northern parts of the United States who saw things much differently. Unlike their relatives down in the South, who had grown up terrified of white people, African Americans in the North, in places like New York, Chicago, experienced white people being afraid of them. And there's actually a lot of very interesting literature written by African American civil rights leaders in the North, speaking about just the feeling of power that came with seeing white people, head down, shoulders up, run across the street when they saw them coming. And on the one hand, it made them feel, this shame and this rage, but it also made them feel this feeling of power and this feeling like we can actually overcome the white people, because this idea, obviously, of like a black insurgency down in the South, good luck with that. You're fighting against a bunch of rednecks who outnumber you 20-1. You're not going to win that fight. But in the North, there was this feeling like this could really happen. And what ended up happening is you had this idea with a lot of these more militant, young African Americans who felt like this should be a black-only movement. This should be a black-led movement. We don't need white money. We especially don't need Jewish money, because for a lot of African Americans in the North, Jews were their landlords. Jews were the people who were screwing them over. We don't need these people involved. And then on top of that, you had the 1967 war, which really sealed in a lot of African American, at least within those circles, this idea that Israel is not who we should be with, that we actually identify with the Palestinians and they're the oppressed and downtrodden. And when you look at Israel, you look at it through the lens that people tend to see the world today, that these students protesting most likely see the world, the lens of oppressor versus oppressed. And when you see this powerful army of Israelis, many of whom are European descent, driving in tanks, bombing from aircrafts, Arabs who are being beaten back by a surprise attack from Israel, and this is how obviously they saw it, by a surprise military attack from Israel, they began accepting this third worldist view of the world, of where brown people and black people need to come together and create this movement for themselves and emancipate themselves on their own. And then, of course, that led to 1968. That led to a lot of the riots that we saw, Chicago riots, and the silent majority voting in Richard Nixon, and the disaster of the civil rights movement as it collapsed after that. Okay, a very long sort of tangent on American Black Jewish history. Fast forwarding a little bit now, I think, to the present day and the way that sort of blacks and Jews are cooperating now, because you are seeing a lot of Jews in these movements, in these pro-Palestinian movements. And what I think is the driving force behind that. And I know it's cliche, but I gotta point the finger at Benjamin Netanyahu. I think Benjamin Netanyahu, in his 2015 congressional address, when Obama was at the cusp of completing the Iran nuclear deal, Bibi, who had made it his essentially political life's work to stop Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, or even just being outside of the sort of pariah isolationist state that it had been, came to Congress, spoke to both parties, lambasting the president in his home, in his country, and basically selling to Democrats, especially to Jews, to left-wing Jews, you're either with me in Israel or you're with the United States and the president. And I think when you put a lot of young American Jews, left-leaning Jews in that position, they're going to choose their home country. And that's what a lot of them did, and a lot of them became fiercely anti-Israel, and a lot of them became attached to this movement that has, to this day, in my opinion, embraced third worldism and has been very pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel.
Wow, you bring up a lot of really interesting points there.
That was a lot.
That was good. It was good. You got it all out. No, that was really good. Really good. I'm trying to think where I wanna start.
I think we talked about the uniqueness of the violence on campus today as a result of Israel. And what I wanted to point out was that in the late 1960s and early 70s, when you had these northern protests in universities like Berkeley and Columbia, in fact, Columbia was a big one, that were violently suppressed, sometimes even by the National Guard. A lot of it had to do actually with Israel. A lot of it were anti-Israel protests. These protests are not a new phenomenon. We're actually, in many political pundits have said that we're reliving 1968, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to a point that you mentioned earlier about the identification that some American Jews have with the pro-Palestinian protests that we're seeing on many campuses throughout the United States. And first, I'm going to put out a disclaimer here. I don't know how many American Jews are statistically supporting Palestinians. I haven't seen any polls. I don't know if maybe you've seen polls on the issue, polling American Jews.
I haven't seen any polls, really.
So I don't know if this is like a very significant movement or if this is something that is, just like how Israel and its supporters like to take out the token Muslim to say that it also has some support on the other side.
News, just real quick. That son of Hamas guy, right? He's been all over the news lately.
Right. So I don't know if these are the counterparts to the token Muslims that Israel brings out. I don't know if these are, the quote-unquote token Jews that join these Palestinian protests. I don't even want to get into that point because I just don't have the data before me, so I really don't know.
From what I have read, what I do understand, I think it's more, you can actually break it down more on age than religion. I think typically if you're younger and Jewish in America, you tend to be more left-wing and you're more likely going to be pro-Palestinian. Whereas if you're older and Jewish, you're going to be firmly pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli.
Right, but again, we have to look at the numbers here. Yeah, I don't know if we're talking about very significant groups of people, but I think regardless, even if we're talking about a few token Jews, or if we're talking about a mass movement that's taking over young American Jewish life in the United States, regardless of whichever way it goes, I think there is an interesting point that you're bringing up here, where we're basically talking about how Jewish identity plays into American identity. Where I think for a lot of American Jews, their Jewish identity is, especially if you're not religious, especially if you're secular, your Jewish identity is not in my opinion, a hugely defining part of your day-to-day existence.
Yeah.
And I think that, sometimes I see opinion polls by Pew and other respectable organizations that poll American Jews and see a significant amount of American Jews saying that their Jewish identity is very important to them, significant amount who say it's not important to them. There is some difference there, some variation there. But I think that putting these polls aside, at least from my own personal experience, I don't think that the average American Jew, especially if you're not connected to religious life in the United States, I think the average American Jew does not look at their Jewish identity as being a fundamental part of who they are. I think that the average American Jew looks at other key values that they have as a part of their own identity as being much more important than their Jewish identity. And again, this is not to say everyone. There are many American Jews, including yours truly, who look at their own Jewish identity as being very, very critical and important to them. And I myself am not religious, so I can't make grand statements here about everyone. But I think that American Jews, by and large, don't look at the Jewish component as being fundamental to who they are versus other components like their American identity, their local identity, their ties based on age, and of course, other racial considerations of whiteness and what have you. But I think that because of this notion of not really putting too much emphasis on Jewish identity in the United States, I think that it places American Jews in this uncomfortable position where they're kind of being forced to give an opinion on issues that they don't really have a clear stake in one way or another. And what ultimately happens, I think, is even putting aside like I said, the amount of American Jews that ultimately join these pro-Palestinian protests, I think the very fact that it's entered a discussion in American Jews of the way that it's entered really does touch on this fact that Jewish identity is not as tribal in the United States the way as it is, for example, in Israel, where it is a fundamental part of the tribe that you're a part of.
You know what? We even talked about it in a previous episode, how for us, Jewish identity really didn't come into play until we became more involved with Israel in one way or another. How coming to Israel was more of an exploration, and even for me, I would say seeking of that identity. And what I wonder now in the States is that it's similar to kind of whiteness in the United States right now, where most white people don't really identify as being white, but that identity is forced on them one way or another by the rest of the non-white United States. And I wonder if the American Jews are going through a similar sort of experience with their Judaism, where either you are, as an American Jew, you are basically guilty until proven innocent in your assumptions about Israel. And there is an expectation that you will take a side one way or another. Whereas for most American Jews, I think, as you mentioned, Israel is probably a little bit more closer to them. They're probably a little bit more concerned about the conflict and about the war than your average American. But at the same time, I mean, speaking with like my sister, for instance, she's a great example, an American Jew, who for her, the conflict, despite having her brother, fight in the war and now living here, aside from just worrying about me and that, she's not following the news in Israel. She does not want to talk about it. She feels uncomfortable, actually. People bring it up to her. She's like, I don't want a part of this. I don't want to be expected to have an opinion just because I'm a Jewish girl living in America. And I wonder if that's an experience that probably a lot of American Jews are feeling right now.
I think a lot of American Jews are feeling that. And I think that there's a certain guilt that comes with American Jewish identity that makes, for a lot of American Jews, regardless of the conflict, I think makes it much more comfortable for them to kind of just assimilate and let themselves take on the greater classification of whiteness that allows them to kind of be forgotten amongst the greater population divisions of the United States. And I think a lot of American Jews allow themselves to kind of, on purpose, allow themselves to fall between the cracks and not be as visible and as noticeable. I think probably by and large, if you ask on some sort of opinion poll, average American Jew, do you support Israel or oppose Israel? I'm sure that the vast majority of American Jews, and I think I've read polls like this before, are supportive of Israel and do have some sort of sense of attachment to their identity.
Most of them are Zionists for sure.
Right. Most are Zionists and most are... But again, I think that there is a question of how much are these beliefs passive and how much are these beliefs a fundamental part of their identity. And, it's funny. We sometimes talk about it when we speak about voting and what causes an individual to switch sides in voting for certain political parties or for certain individuals. And you can sometimes ask people in opinion polls, what is your opinion on a certain topic? And you can see that 90% support one thing and 10% support another. And if you make a decision based on that poll, you might be quite certain to go with that 90% because that's the smart move to make. But what you don't know is that only that 10% that's opposed to this measure or support an opposing measure, these are the only people that are actually going to change their vote based on what you do on this issue. And the 90% doesn't really care. And I think that's the situation when it comes for a lot of American Jews and their Jewish identity. I think a lot of American Jews have a very passive understanding of their own identity, where they identify as Jewish, they're probably proud to be Jewish, probably have some sense of pride and connection with the state of Israel. That's the mainstream American Jew. And I wouldn't say even young American Jews, despite some of the phenomena that we're seeing in the United States. I think most young American Jews are a part of that camp as well. But what allows a lot of alternate identities to kind of seep in is this real desire by a lot of American Jews to just say, leave me alone. I don't want to have anything to do with this.
I just want to live my life. I want to do the American
life.
dream. Yeah.
Exactly.
I totally agree, and I think that's they're starting to live in a situation where that's no longer an option, where they are being forced to confront their own sense of identity and not only that, I mean, you really see on these protests, the protesters love lifting up the American Jews who are with them as these sort of symbols of their own righteousness. And for a lot of the American Jews involved, they don't feel like Israel really represents their left-wing values. And so just that alone they're going to be against. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu, if he were an American politician, I think he would firmly be a Republican. And I think he's, we've seen him cozy up like to Mitt Romney, to Donald Trump especially. And a lot of American Jews see that and they go, okay, this guy's basically a Republican. I'm against that. I'm against him, and I'm against Israel. This actually also brings me to something that I absolutely hate about the era that we're living through right now, which is the whole Israel-Palestine conflict is almost a litmus test that forces you to choose between Bibi Netanyahu and Yahya Sinwar, two extreme, terrible people, and it's like you are either in one camp or the other. And what infuriates me is you don't see a lot of just the people saying, look, the Israeli government as it stands today is fundamentally flawed. It is extreme in its measures, extreme in its policy. I don't agree with that. And I also, I don't agree. Or on the flip side, the Palestinians who say, I don't agree with Yahya Sinwar his extreme way of bringing about Palestinian freedom. I can say that I want a Palestinian state and I want Palestinian freedom and all that, but I don't want these extremist people at the helm leading us into what is essentially an endless war.
Well, I actually do think that there is a lot of conversation. I don't know if I fully agree with you on that point. I think there's certainly in Israel there is a lot of conversation about Netanyahu and
no, I'm not talking about Israelis internally speaking to each other. I'm talking about the pro-Israel versus pro-Palestinian speaking to each other publicly.
Right. Well, I think for them this is all just a question of, at the end of the day, tribal orientation and tribal identification. Yeah, like it's identifying with a side that you want to be a part of, and you want people to see that you're a part of that side. Yeah, like I think that the nuances, you mentioned this earlier quite well when you spoke about, how much does the average 19-year-old understand about what's going on in Israel, and a lot of these pro-Palestinian protesters that took over American campuses, probably, not all of them, but probably a lot of them are largely disconnected from the conflict. And I think that's what kind of leads to a lack of nuance in the United States. I don't think it's because the United States or Americans are careless in about these sorts of issues. I just think that these individuals that are coming out to protest but are not interested in nuance. Yeah, they're interested in supporting their tribe and bringing their tribe to the top. Which brings me to something that I wanted to mention earlier, where we're speaking about, the token Jews or these token Jewish groups that are supporting pro-Palestinians, and on the other side, these token Muslims and token Arabs that are coming out to support Israel. And I think it should be mentioned that there is a clear interest of both of these groups to do what they're doing because it's amazing content. Yeah, we have to put this on the table here that for the... I don't want to name specific names because, some of these people are, especially in the pro-Israel camp that I'm a part of, I think are doing great work. But we should put this on the table that if you're a Palestinian that waves an Israeli flag, or if you're an American Jew that goes to give a speech at Columbia against Israel, you're probably going to get a lot of support from the greater public because that sort of content of individuals who have been who are woke in their own way and have been exposed to the truth in their own way are able to sell content that really sells.
Not only that, but it allows the group that they're participating in to say, hey, we can't be anti-Jewish, we can't be anti-Muslim. Look, we have this Jewish person right here giving this speech. Right. And it reminds me of the clearly racist person who's like, how can I be racist? My best friend is black.
Right, exactly.
It doesn't mean anything.
Right, exactly. Or it's, and I see it a lot of the time at these pro-Israel protests, which is why I know that not all of them, but a lot of these anti-Israel protests definitely have a significant number of anti-Semites, because I see the exact same language on the pro-Israel side, and I understand this coded language and what's behind it. When a pro-Israel supporter says, "Here, look, we have such and such who came from Gaza and is talking about how much he hates Hamas and how much he supports Israel," I understand that what's behind that is a fundamental view of racism against Palestinians, where we're kind of just viewing them through a very specific lens of those who are exposed to the truth and those who aren't exposed to the truth. And because I could see that side, I could also see that probably at these anti-Israel protests in the United States, it's probably the same exact formula of hatred going on here, where these individuals who are actively trying to bring Jews to come out to these protests to come against Israel, they themselves are clearly playing on coded language to lower the racist intent of these protests, or the anti-Semitic essence of these protests. And for those who come out to speak that are themselves Jewish, like I said, I think that a lot of them are interested in self-promotion. They know that it's great content. They know they're going to get a lot of likes on Facebook and a lot of support on Instagram, and this is what they want to do also for themselves.
Listen, you're probably right about that. For some, I don't want to downplay the fact that there is a lot of legitimate passion behind a lot of these protesters, and that the fact is that for a lot of these Jewish people who are speaking at a lot of these anti-Israel protests, they really feel a responsibility. And I really think they actually feel a moral responsibility, in the sense that my voice, for exactly the reasons that we just mentioned, is going to be much louder than the people around here. And so I have a responsibility to speak out of what I see as an injustice in the world. I really do believe those people exist, and there are, of course, the grifters and the cynics who will take advantage of any crisis as an opportunity. But I think there are people as well who legitimately believe in what they're doing has some meaning and purpose behind it. And I think that these protesters, the majority of whom do believe that. I really do think that Americans at their core are fundamentally good people. I know that that's probably getting a lot of snickers, but I really do think that Americans are guided by a sense of principles, but guided by a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And for a lot of Americans, they see the numbers, they see the deaths, they see the dead children, and they say, this is wrong, and I want this to stop. And for someone whose life is not one way or another involved or affected by Israel-Palestine, and who just is basing this off pure principle and what they're seeing in the news, I can see why someone would be so passionate about these protests and want to at least do their part. And not only that, because there's always the critics who say, well, you care so much about Israel-Palestine, but what about when Assad was massacring Syrians, or what in the Congo, or this and that? The difference is that Israel is being given billions of dollars by the U.S. government. And the U.S. government is providing international political cover for Israel in the UN and in other areas as well. And that the U.S. government actually can pressure Israel to stop. To be clear, I don't think they could ever stop Israel. I think Bibi Netanyahu and most Israelis are ready to continue fighting without the U.S.'s support. It's going to mean basically, I think, a redrafting in an extremely bloody battle in which the Israelis will be fighting with very limited, if not non-existent air cover, probably very few mortar and tank shells. But Israel is capable of producing a lot of its own weaponry as well. And it will just mean that Israel will probably be hitting a recession, if not depression, by the end of the war.
So I actually think that your earlier explanation of what mobilizes these protesters is more convincing, where we spoke about the tribal nature of cross-group identity, where you mentioned how a lot of, for example, African Americans who in the early 1960s were more supportive of Israel because they identified with the state of Israel as a similar oppressed group of people that they see shared characteristics with, and later that changed when, from their perspective, Israel moved from oppressed to oppressor. I think that's what's really playing out right now in the United States. I don't view it through the lens of good versus bad. I personally think that
oppressor versus oppressed is good versus bad. It's a very black and white type situation. But oppressor equals bad and oppressed equals good.
But if that was the case, then we would be seeing these pro-Palestinian protesters coming out against October 7th. And if that was the case, we would see pro-Israel protesters coming out against the scenes that we're seeing in Gaza of collateral damage, argue it one way or another, whether it's intentional or not intentional. That is taking place in the Gaza Strip. Again, I'm not pinning this just on the Palestinian side. I'm discussing from my perspective is the social explanation for what we're seeing. I don't think it's a good versus bad thing. I think that at the end of the day, once you pick your group, you're gonna view everything through the lens of that group. It might be good and bad from their perspective, but I think that I take issue with the way that you framed it, because I think you framed it from a very objective perspective of Americans are objectively good and objectively bad. I think Americans are subjectively good and subjectively bad. I think Americans subjectively look at the world through, just like any other people, not just Americans. People look at the world through their own understanding of what good and bad is. And when it comes to conflict and the other side's getting hurt, nobody cares about what happens to them. And that's true, just as true for the Israelis as it is for the Palestinians. And I think that can largely explain a lot of what we're seeing in the United States. I don't think it's a question of good and bad.
Listen, I don't want to make the claim that Americans are just this inherently good group, are a group of good people. But the way that Americans tend to view the world is because Americans view the world through a set of principles. Most countries, in my opinion, exist for the protection of their own ethnic group. That's how Israel is not unique in the sense that it's like kind of a semi-ethnic ethno-state in the sense that it's created, its purpose is designed for the protection and longevity of the Jewish people. Most nations have laws that base citizenship on direct relation to its own nationality. So you can't become a German citizen unless you have a German parent or grandparent or you were born in Germany, that sort of thing. And so they tend to see the world through that own self-interest, whereas America is a national project that was founded through this ideology of democracy and human and basic, inalienable rights. And that is how Americans tend to perceive the world, through this sort of sense of morality. Look, this is not me whitewashing American history. I don't mean it to be, and I'm sorry if it sounds like I am. Let's be clear, America has done absolutely criminal things to other countries throughout its own history. I'm not trying to wave that away and say, American policy has always been based on these issues of morality. No, not at all true. Americans, as a people, tend to, however, view the world in that sense. And to push back on the good versus bad take, maybe I'm not explaining myself quite well enough here. I think oppressor versus oppressed, which is the lens that a lot of young people tend to see the world, it is connected in their minds. And I'm not saying this in an objective sense. I'm saying in their minds subjectively, oppressor and oppressed are intimately connected with good versus evil. That the oppressor is, and this is what we tend to see also when studying counterterrorism theory, is that the oppressor is very limited in its ability to use force and propaganda, whereas the oppressed, they are considered only responsible for themselves. They can take extreme measures and do things that the counterinsurgents can't do, because the idea is that the oppressed have the moral high ground in order to be able to free themselves from the oppressor. And so there is this kind of good versus bad type situation going on here. And look, if you want to talk about why aren't the pro-Palestinian protesters protesting against October 7th, there's a myriad of reasons. A lot of them will say, well, there's this entire war is overshadowed by this reality that Palestinians have been a stateless people for 75 years who live under the boot of the Israeli military. They pointed to the idea of Gaza being an open-air prison. Israelis, when you ask them, why aren't you protesting the death of Palestinian civilians, a lot of them will point to the videos they saw on October 7th of Palestinian civilians, crowds of them cheering the corpses of Israeli civilians being dragged through the streets. There is a distinct lack of empathy on both sides, and that comes from a history of 100 years of fighting each other.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I don't think it's unique to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think any group of people, whether they're defined in the ethno-state sense, like you mentioned about Israel, or in the religious sense, like the way Hamas self-identifies, or in the ideal-based ethical sense, like America does or ought to identify itself as a nation of based on shared ideals. No matter how you cut the cake, everything is based on tribes and group identification. You have your group versus other groups. And I think that this is nothing unique to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in my opinion at least. I think this is something that's very unique to people and the way that people view conflict and see themselves within the context of armed conflict. I want to take this conversation as we wrap up this episode today, as we wrap up today's episode, to what's going on in Rafah, where we're talking a lot about the stuff that's happening in the United States, a lot of the anti-Israel protests that we're seeing on a lot of college campuses. And this is happening at a time when Israel and Hamas, as I mentioned during our news recap, seem to be at an impasse in negotiations over the release of hostages that are being held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And Israel recently launched a raid into eastern Rafah in which it captured the Palestinian side of the border crossing with Egypt.
The Keren crossing,
And it captured the crossing and also has taken control of the main road, Sarach al-Din, that bisects north to south of the Gaza Strip, or at least the section that's near the border with Egypt. And, a lot of commentators said that once Israel goes into Rafah and does what it's claiming that it's going to do, the entire world, including the United States, including the American public, including the European public, everywhere, everybody who's anywhere is going to oppose Israel and is going to impose massive international pressure on Israel. And what we're saying here is the Israelis, in my opinion, doing a pretty smart move where they're saying rather than invade, we're going to do a little raid here, a little raid there, a little raid here, a little raid there, and kind of let this slowly pass on without getting on the international public's radar. What's your take on this?
My opinion is the Israelis have no choice besides doing limited raids. At the end of the day, Israel has, at the height of the war, when Israel was in Gaza, when you and I were drafting the IDF, 7% of the economic workforce was in the IDF. That cannot go on for very long. Israel simply does not have the manpower to carry out a proper counterinsurgent war in the way that the Americans were able to do in Iraq, for instance. As a result, Israel is really only limited to airstrikes and to raids within these areas.
Though I do think it's important to mention, I agree with you that Israel does have limited options here. I do think it's important to mention that this limited military activity is very different from what the Americans were asking the Israelis to do. The Americans were asking the Israelis to carry out limited raids in the sense of limited special forces raids that would target mainly Hamas's leadership in Rafah. Whereas what the Israelis are doing is limited from another angle. They're not limited in terms of the scope of the military operation. The neighborhoods that Israel's been going into during these raids are very, very significant, and the degree to which the army is operating is very significant. What's limited is the geography that Israel is playing its cards, right? The state of Israel and the Israel Defense Forces in particular is choosing slices of Rafah that it's going into. And I think unlike what the Americans were asking the Israelis, I don't think the Israelis are going to, at least at this stage of the Rafah operation, are going to leave the territories that it captured, meaning it's going to move in, take a certain territory, clear it out, and then move on to the next territory. I think the limited nature of the Israeli response is not limited like the Americans want in terms of the sort of manpower used and the scope of the operation. I think what we're going to see is mainly limited in terms of total geography at any given point in time that the battleground's going to be fought on.
Can you actually dive in a little deeper as to what the Americans wanted the Israelis to do and how that differs from actual Israeli tactics at the moment?
The Americans basically, from what we understand, I didn't see clear plans published for the public to see and to criticize. Maybe this was passed on behind the scenes between American defense officials and Israeli defense officials. But to the best of my knowledge, from what I've been reading in open source news accounts, the Americans have been asking Israel to not invade Rafah in a full-blown ground maneuver in which it would take over Rafah the way that it did in North Gaza and in Khan Yunis. Rather, carry out very limited targeted attacks on Hamas with the emphasis on its leadership in Rafah. So I think that from the American perspective, they're ideal for Rafah. From what I understand from this coded, unclear language coming out of Washington, I think their ideal is what Israel is doing in the West Bank, right? Where it doesn't maneuver in Palestinian cities on a day-to-day basis, but here and there it sends in a special forces raid, here and there it sends in an airstrike and tries to carry out the airstrike in as limited of a fashion as possible. And we spoke about this in a previous episode, and I believe our opinion was shared on this, that if Israel is going into Rafah, probably carrying out such raids against a united, military-sized, brigade-sized force of Hamas and Rafah is probably not the best idea for the Israel Defense Forces at this stage, which can explain the Israeli tactic at this stage, right? The Israelis are saying we're going to go limited, but limited for us is geography. The geography that we are going to go into, we're going to go with full force, which is what we saw in Eastern Rafah. It's clearing out 100,000 Palestinians who are living in Eastern Rafah, telling them go to Khan Yunis and find shelter there, and we're going to go full force in this very small territory that we want to capture and take over.
So going slice by slice, basically, instead of just picking a spot and from there sending raids into all directions.
Exactly. I think that the next thing that we're going to see, logically, yeah, I mean, this is anybody who logically looks at a map is going to see this, is that Israel's probably going to capture the rest of Gaza's border crossing with Egypt, the rest of the Philadelphia corridor, and it's going to slowly but surely take over parts of Rafah and balance this operation with the international pressure that it's afraid of bringing on. I agree with you that there's some degree of manpower issue going on in Israel, but I think the real Israeli worry here is the international pressure and the massive anti-Israel protests that we're seeing throughout the world. And for that reason, I don't think we're going to see any day that's going to come where the Israelis are invading Rafah and that's it. The invasion started today. We're not going to see some sort of start of the operation the way that the world is expecting. I think that we're going to see slowly but surely raids that one way or another we're going to understand, okay, the Israel is de facto in Rafah, which, by the way, I should point out, not entirely different from what Israel did in North Gaza. Israel did do a full-on ground maneuver in North Gaza, but for the first 48 hours there, it very successfully confused the world, in which it carried out a series of raids throughout the area north of Wadi Aza, and the world was kind of looking at Israel like, okay, what are you doing? And it kind of gave time for the media to digest this shock event of the military going into North Gaza, and it allowed Israel to, I think, buy some time before it ultimately was criticized in the media like what we're seeing today.
I think, tactically, you're right. Israel's main concern is not its lack of manpower. It's the amount of international pressure. It's the United States potentially delaying weapon sales, which they have already done. At the end of the day, the United States is congressionally obligated to give Israel the military aid that the Congress voted to give it, but the president can always delay the shipments for whatever bullshit reason he wants to, and that's exactly what he's doing right now. And again, not for no reason. Bibi did say that the Americans were betraying them after they asked the Israelis to go back to the table. Bibi forgets who butters his bread sometimes, I think. But at the end of the day, there is the tactical consideration to be aware of. And the Americans themselves, look, the Americans, their entire military doctrine is based around counterinsurgency. They've been fighting that war for the past 2 decades. For the Israelis, this is a brand new war. I listened actually recently to an interview with David Petraeus, who is considered one of the most brilliant military tacticians of the 21st century. He was responsible for the complete turnaround in U.S. strategy in around 2006, 2007, in which violence within Iraq was cut by about 80%, including military deaths, civilian deaths, not insurgent deaths. Insurgent deaths were still extremely high. David Petraeus is very much considered to be one of the most brilliant minds that have come out of the U.S. military lately. And one of the way he breaks down counterinsurgency, he breaks it down in a very simple, digestible way: capture, hold, build. And his biggest criticism of the Israelis is that the Israelis can capture, but they cannot hold. We don't have the manpower for it, and they cannot build. And so at the end of the day, I can understand why the Americans would say, look, stop trying to capture territory. We already see in North Gaza, since the Israelis have pulled out, that Hamas is reasserting its power. It's reasserting its military might there. It has essentially become, once again, the de facto government of northern Gaza. And the same thing's going to happen in Rafah. The Israelis can't stay forever. So instead, use your powerful special forces in order to go and take out Hamas's spiritual leaders, because there is a chance that if Hamas's leadership is dead by the time the war is over, then Hamas as a political organization will no longer be able to function. And that is the exact reason why the Americans, despite Osama bin Laden being so far away from Afghanistan and Iraq by the time he was killed, spent so much time and resources trying to kill this guy, because he was, in essence, the sort of spiritual propaganda leader that Al-Qaeda could rally around. And his death brought about the end of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, when then they, of course, replaced ISIS, so not much better. But that's exactly what I think will happen in Gaza if the Israelis are successful in finding, capturing, killing Sinwar and any of the other Hamas leaders in Gaza. And so I can understand the American perspective in saying, look, you guys can't do what you have to do in order to fight an actual counterinsurgency, so just focus on killing the leadership, or at least putting direct pressure on the leadership, which may help you make a hostage negotiation in terms that are favorable to you.
Well, look, putting aside whether or not these things should be mutually exclusive or not, killing Sinwar and Muhammad Def sounds like two things that will successfully bring about. And yeah, I guess we have to see how this is going to play out in the Gaza Strip. All eyes are on Rafah right now, and let's see how the Israelis play their cards.
Yep, I totally agree. Let's see what happens. All right, well, thank you everybody for listening. Speak soon.